think this is a very important occasion. I do want to say Ash will be up here shortly leading us through the presentation, assisted by Matt Marshquist. And the people on the Sustainability Committee just want to raise their hands. Kyle, I see Kyle, and Rob Muhlenbeck and Marge. Yeah, so these are the folks that are going to be carrying the ball on this, and thank you for coming out and supporting this effort. This past Monday we celebrated or observed the 50th Earth Day since 1970, and yes, thank you, very good. I see this crowd is already on my side or revved up. So the I think it is an occasion, at least thinking back a little bit about the lessons of Earth Day on this occasion and how they're applicable to today. That was a time when, and those of you who are old enough to remember it, I've got a pop quiz. Who started the EPA? Which president? Nixon. Can you believe it? See, that's what, yeah. So, that was when people decided, that was the first time that I think there was widespread understanding that the environment was something that we had to watch out for, that we had to protect and take progressive positive action. So we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, land conservation, all came from that time period. And in the 50 years since then, or 49 years since then, a lot of those issues have been addressed, some more effectively than others, but a pretty good amount of progress. One thing, of course, that hasn't progressed is greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Since that time, carbon in the atmosphere has increased about 27%. I know Matt's going to say it's 26.5% or something, but about, so it's been growing, and we haven't addressed it. So, so I firmly believe this is our moment to address it. And just like back in 1970, we've now got a new set of challenges. And I think that's why I was so pleased that the rest of the members of the board, the select board, and I'm going to recognize those who are here. Steve Mitchell is here from the Board of Selectmen, and our town manager, Mike Herbert, is here. If you guys want to just raise your hand so people could. And Steve had a run-in with some organic nature known as poison ivy, so that's why he's, but anyway, yeah. So, but I was very pleased when the board last year asked me to work with sustainability to craft the NetZero initiative, which is the next step. Ashland, as many of you know, is a green community. We've done a number of great things. We have a 100% renewable energy portfolio, thanks to our town manager's negotiation skills, 100% renewable energy that any resident can get in on at a very competitive price. So we've done a number of things like that, but of course we need to do more, and the Net Zero initiative is our next initiative. And I think it's especially important when you see today that we have indifference and outright hostility at the federal level with the Trump administration, that it's very essential, more than ever, that we at the local level put forth, really lead, and local and state level do the lead. And that's really, what we're doing here today. So, I hope and expect that you'll join me in that effort in supporting sustainability. And this night marks the beginning of that effort. The board of the select board laid out a process for public education starting tonight. There's going to be an information session at town meeting, and then an actual resolution proposal at the special town meeting next November. So, I think I firmly believe that climate change is the issue of our time, or one of the preeminent issues of our time, certainly. And so I'm pleased to see you all here tonight, and know you will support me and support the Sustainability Committee in this effort. So with that, so thank you, and I'll turn this over to Ash.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So Ashwin Ratan-Chandani, I'm part of the Sustainability Committee. I've got Matt with me here as well. It's our first time doing this, so we weren't quite sure what kind of a crowd we'd get, and we weren't quite sure how many of you were well educated about climate science. So we decided to dumb it down just a tad bit, take it back a little bit, and talk about what climate change is, why it's happening. Let's just do a quick poll maybe in the room. How many folks here do understand why the climate is changing? All right, excellent. So we can skip through all the presentation then. But how many folks here have a feeling for what the term net zero means? Excellent, all right. And how many folks actually understand how much carbon we put out in the atmosphere and why that's an important thing to understand? Fair, all right. So hopefully this will still be interesting for some of you. I think the first few slides we're probably going to just skip through, but before we even get into the slides, what we plan to do is like I said, walk through a little bit of a process around what is greenhouse effect, why carbon's important and why we should care about and how much do we put out there. And then rather than spending a ton of time listening to me, since you guys are already well educated, we're going to put you guys to work. We're going to break you up into small groups, and we're going to maybe have you think about, as a community, what we can be doing to address the problems that we have, and to help us start defining what the plan is, right? So we'll break this up. You will probably spend about 15, 20 minutes, just giving you sort of the basics, and then do a little bit of a breakout, and then bring everybody back again, and sort of maybe summarize what we all thought about. Fair enough? All right. All right, so let's just stick to the greenhouse effect. Sunlight, we got atmosphere, we got an Earth, got gases out there, some of the sun hits, and the thicker the atmosphere, the more the heat that's retained. One of the things that actually ends up retaining stuff is that carbon in the air, right? So that's kind of why it's important. And that portion of the science is fairly well settled. How do we know that? If you look at some of our neighboring planets, right? So Venus out there, very, very thick atmosphere, contains about 96% carbon in that atmosphere. Average temperature, about 780 degrees Fahrenheit. Us, right? We've got, and some of the images went away, that's supposed to have a little glow on it, but either way, we've got a relatively thick atmosphere, we've got multiple layers, but we only have about 0.03% carbon in it. So it makes up a very small portion. We are about 59 degrees. Mars actually has a very, very thin atmosphere. A lot of it actually is carbon-based, but it's extremely thin. And average temperature is about minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty stark. There's not much arguing about those numbers, right? So clearly carbon matters, clearly the atmosphere matters, and clearly greenhouse effect does exist, right? The other piece that folks sometimes get confused about, right, is what is global warming, what is climate change, right? And traditionally, I think scientists talked about global warming, and it was about the warming of the average temperature on Earth over a period of time. And then you've had folks kind of come back and say, well, but it's cold outside right now. Well, that's weather. That's not climate. And guess what? When it's cold here, Australia is kind of baking, down there. So we are talking about the Earth. We're not talking about only action or a point in time or a point in place. So the term that folks have started using now is sort of climate change, which talks about the long-term changes in climate, which is, average temperature, average precipitation, right? And over time, that clearly is a trend that has been going up. So let's just wanted to kind of spend.
Hi, this is Bill Putman. I'm a climate scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. What you're looking at is a supercomputer model of carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere. The visualization compresses 1 year of data into a few minutes. Carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas affected by human activity. About half of the carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuel combustion remains in the atmosphere, while the other half is absorbed by natural land and ocean reservoirs. In the Northern Hemisphere, we see the highest concentrations are focused around major emission sources over North America, Europe, and Asia. Notice how the gas doesn't stay in one place. The dispersion of carbon dioxide is controlled by the large-scale weather patterns within the global circulation. During spring and summer in the Northern Hemisphere, plants absorb a substantial amount of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, thus removing some of the gas from the atmosphere. We see this change in the model as the red and purple colors start to fade. Meanwhile, in the southern hemisphere, we see the release of another pollutant, carbon monoxide. This is a gas that's both harmful to the environment and to humans. During the summer months, plumes of carbon monoxide stream from fires in Africa, South America, and Australia, contributing to high concentrations in the atmosphere. Notice how these emissions are also transported by winds to other parts of the world. As summer transitions to fall and plant photosynthesis decreases, carbon dioxide
A few
begins
things
to
I wanted you
accumulate
to
in the
maybe,
atmosphere.
kind of pick up here, and it just basically transitions back into winter here, so don't have to sort of spend the whole time, it'll go back to orange there. The few things, this talks about carbon and how we've been kind of putting it out there. One of the things to think about is, as much carbon as we put out there, about half of that, if you remember what he said, half of that gets absorbed back. And it is absorbed back. There is a mechanism that the Earth has of absorbing carbon. But the other half kind of stays, and it stays for hundreds of years. So every little bit that we put out there, half will go away, and the other half will stay. And that's actually a critical portion of what net zero starts getting into, because it's about putting that balance together, right? And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of show that to you and show how much we do put out. And you can see in spring, summer, the trees are pulling it back. You see that little clearing happen, right? So let's keep moving on. We started maintaining records of temperature that became consistent worldwide around 1880, right? And so from that point onwards, scientists have been sort of tracking that rise. Now, what this chart is really showing you is the anomaly in temperatures. That means how much change has happened on a year-on-year basis. So that's not the actual temperature. It's really showing how much change has happened. And if you sort of look at that trend line there, 1880 to about 1940, think about that area, or actually 1880 to roughly that area, 1920. That's around the beginning of that industrial age sort of happening. And then from that point on, you got the industrial age, and you see the sort of spike up of temperatures. And on this side, this chart's actually showing you the average CO2 level from thousands of years back, right? So from 0 to 1950, you kind of had a high point of around 300 that's never been breached historically. Right there, around 1950, which is right about there, as the temperature started going up, you can see that peak sort of happens. And again, fairly stark in my mind, right? You kind of see that correlation immediately. Those two things sort of happen. You got the modeling that sort of is showing you that the carbon is going up there, and this is again fairly settled science, right? So there's not much argument that you can have about that. All right, so what do we do about it, and why Ashland, right? So I wanted to kind of show you another image. It's sometimes hard to think about carbon, and what is carbon? How big is it? So we found this cool graphic. What this is modeling is the average amount of carbon a person in the United States, an average person in the United States, emits per year. Put in comparison, not just with the rest of the world, that's a person, roughly, right? So this is based on volume. That's that's about roughly, think about a ranch-style house, a 1250 square foot ranch-style house, roughly speaking, right, would represent about 1 ton of metric ton of carbon. That's us, every one of us. So if someone's going to do something about it, I think we better be on that leading edge, right? And it isn't so much about, we actually within the sustainability committee had a conversation as we were putting this resolution out there. And honestly, we spend a lot of time sort of educating ourselves about what net zero is. Should it be something that we should focus on? And one of the points that we talked about was, we're not seeing that kind of change, right? Ashland's not a coastal community. We don't see that kind of flood. We are fortunate. We are sitting higher up on the watershed as well. We don't see that kind of flooding. The biggest thing we could think of was we got a lot more ticks. And as a dog owner, that's a bit of a problem, but still. This graphic sort of brought it back to us, kind of going, oh, no, we are the problem, right? And every one of us is the problem. And clearly, if stuff's not going to happen at the national level, there is clear consensus now that cities and towns are on that leading edge. and they can probably make the biggest change. And that's why it's important for us to be doing something about it. Even as a smaller community, we are surrounded by a lot of communities who are actually taking this seriously, who are actually putting the effort into it, and this is why it's important for us to start thinking about our effect and what we can do about that effect. Good news is there is stuff we can do about it. Bad news is probably don't have a ton of time to do it, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit now. So what are the current sort of efforts, right? So, sorry, that font's kind of gone off, but that's supposed to say degree centigrade. The superscript sort of went away. So 2015, the UN Paris Agreement happened. Lots of countries sort of signed up to a goal that said, we have to ensure that we don't go beyond 2% centigrade increase in the average temperature of the Earth in the next 100 years. And at that stage, that was pretty revolutionary because the vast majority of countries signed up to that agreement and said, yeah, we'll keep it under 2 degrees centigrade. Unfortunately, the follow-through, based on current pledges, probably headed to about 2.5. Right? But that's pledges. Based on current policies, more like 3, or closer to 3.5. And the thinking is it might be as much as 4. And if we don't do anything, it's positively going over 4. The other sort of piece that's happened is the consensus now is that 2 degrees is probably too much. And the reason why it's too much is even if we were to have the temperature rise to 2 degrees and then it started dropping because we put the effort into it, there's already going to be catastrophic change and significant change that will not really be recoverable back. And I'll talk a little about what that change might be. So the thinking now is it's really 1.5 degrees that we really have to target in less than 1.5. It's 0.5 degrees. What does 0.5 degrees do? Doubles the number of people that will have less water. Actually, about 60 million more people would have droughts that they would have never seen, just because of that 0.5 degree. So this is the difference between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade. On the converse side, almost double the percentage of people will see the floods. And we've seen that actually happen, more recently. The number of folks that will be exposed to sea level rise, about 10 million more people will be exposed to sea level rise. We're talking about, again, a 0.5 degree change. Arctic sea ice. Even with 1.5 degrees, you will see the Arctic clear of sea ice once every 100 years or so. And I'm talking clear, which doesn't happen today. 2 degrees centigrade, that's once every 10 years. That's pretty much every single species that lives in the Arctic is dependent on sea ice. So you'd see wipeout of those species for sure. Coral decline, we are unfortunately, whether we like it or not, probably looking at about 70 to 90% coral decline anyway, right? Best effort. Get to 2 degrees centigrade, it's no Great Barrier Reef, there's no coral, right, in the sea. In terms of habitat loss, again, it's a 50% increase with that 0.5 degree. Part of it for things like, that Arctic sea ice going away, everything there goes away. Decline in fisheries. I looked at few of these metrics, right? And this actually came from a UN report. The UN actually released, there's an intergovernmental body out there, released a report called the Climate Change 1.5 Degree Report that talked about this kind of change. They also talked about what we can do and how much time we have for this change. But this came from that data. Again, fairly settled science, and the projections are fairly settled. But that 0.5 degrees makes a difference, right? So that IPCC special report I was talking about, right? One of their things was we've already seen a 1 degree change. So we got 0.5 left, right, of that 2 degree. It's already happened. Restricting is possible, according to them. They're optimistic about it. We got 12 years. It means from now, the next 12 years, we need to substantially change the way we deal with things, the way we live, what we eat, how we live, how we structure our businesses, our towns. our residences, how we commute. And then, yes, something is possible. And again, remember, we're one of the bigger problems on that side, right? So again, achieving that change requires an effective net zero. So let's talk about what the concept of net zero is. Remember, if you remember the video we looked at a little bit earlier, carbon goes up, that's natural. That's a natural process that there is carbon in the air, right? So it's not like we're looking to eliminate carbon. What you really want to try and do is get back into a balance. If you remember, half that carbon that goes up gets absorbed back, right? So it's about shifting the way we think, shifting the way we do business or live so that we're able to get back into a balance. We're not suggesting that we stop living, shut all the lights off. What we're suggesting is find the method so that we can bring balance back, so that the amount of carbon that you emit is offset in some way, shape, or form through either trees and then we'll talk about those strategies, right? And one way of thinking about net zero is thinking about a bathtub. So it's fairly simplistic in a way, right? But if you think of emissions as that faucet coming in and the removals, that absorption as a drain pipe, right? We probably are not going to see these removals. We don't have the technology today. The best technology we have is trees, right? Afforestation, actually, rather than deforestation. Afforestation is known to help. Wetlands absorb a tremendous amount of carbon. But the ability to absorb this, probably that pipe's not getting too big. So we probably have to do that, reduce that, right? But there is an ability to balance, right? And so it's not a lost cause, right? If we reduce the problem here, increase that just a little, there's something that can happen there. Fair? So as you think about it, as an individual, it's kind of hard to sort of come up with, what can I do, right? But as a community, we can look at it and say, let's say we have an older building, okay? That's probably not the most efficient, but make the investment in bringing those buildings up to a certain code. The Empire State Building's actually, I'm just going to use a really big building as an example, has made significant improvements. And the cool thing is that as you make those improvements, they're actually saving money, right? Personally, we were just having a conversation. I've now got 2 sets of solar panels on my roof, and I've gone all electric. So I kind of did a little bit of an energy audit, and I'm about 70% there. I'm 70% carbon neutral now. As an individual, I can do those things. That doesn't mean every single person can. Some of us have older houses. It's reality. You can't just go off and change it. But how cool would it be that as Michael looks at some of the newer buildings we're putting out there, we're about to make some fairly significant investments in a school, right? And yeah, Mendez, probably hard to kind of go fix that one, but as we put the new one in, maybe it can be actually carbon positive or net positive rather than neutral, or rather, sorry, net negative, I get confused. Net negative rather than neutral, so that maybe it is generating more energy from renewable sources than it itself consumes and has the ability to offset that older building that is in town. And if we sort of think about it as a community, maybe my driving an electric car and you driving a slightly more efficient car, and then there will be technology change. I'm certainly hopeful there has to be technological change that will help us through. But if we start making those changes now as a community and pick the stretch goals, and then the goal that we're proposing is Ashland becomes carbon neutral 2040 as a town, not saying municipal only, right? A lot of the green community stuff was very focused on the municipality. I'm saying every one of us, in everything we do. That's going to require us to rethink the way our downtown's structured. It's going to have to rethink the way our building codes are structured so that they're no longer just stretch goals that we put out there, but make that part of a mandate. It's going to have to require us to rethink the way we pick up any new project. So this is monumental, but it's a monumental problem, right? To Rob's point earlier, this is the problem for our times, right? So this is a multi-solution thing, right? It's not something you can go solve in one. There's no one silver bullet. In fact, the Empire State example I was using, the manager, of the holding company, I was listening to an interview, and he said, we don't think about it as a silver bullet. We think of it as a silver buckshot, right? Because it's a lot of tiny shots that they kind of fire. And maybe that's the approach we have to take, right? So we have to think about energy efficiency. We have to think about switching to renewable sources. And again, good news, as a town, one of the reasons why I can go net zero or get close to it is because I don't actually have to go put solar panels. Most of my energy can come from renewable sources because it's part of the charter. Cool thing would be if you even got that out of local sources, right? Waste reduction, right? And changing the way we do waste, right? Building codes and zoning changes we talked about. Some food and diet changes as well. I personally love my burgers. My wife is a hardcore vegan. I call her an eco-terrorist. I'm starting to put more plant-based stuff into my diet, and some of it's not that bad, but hey, I'm one guy, right? Offsetting emissions, reforestation, right? Increasing some of our public lands, ensuring that the lands that we have, don't get ripped out, ensuring that the wetlands we have stay healthy. The amount of carbon sequestered into wetlands is enormous. When those plants die, they turn into a bog. It's wetlands that keep them there, right? Making sure that maybe the gas pipeline doesn't go through a wetland. Not supposed to say stuff like that, but other forms of carbon sequestration, right? All right, so that's sort of our thoughts around net zero. I wanted to pause before we kind of did a breakout and see if you had questions. I have been asked that if you have questions that you come up to the mic. I'm happy if you're close enough to me to hand you my mic as well. Went through a brief primer. Hopefully that was useful for you to at least frame the problem and to think through the problem. Any questions I can take that we can answer for you? If you want to come up and I don't know how long this will stretch.
Thank you very much. So my name is Diane, and I was very interested to see the second bullet item in the offsetting emissions. This is news to me, and I just wondered if there's any sort of calculation of how much it matters.
The wetlands?
Like, is there any sort of ability to quantify that? Thank you.
Yep. I'm sure that there are folks smarter than me that have the ability to quantify that. Wayne, maybe you've come across some research. I know it's there. Yeah, I don't have the answer. What I do know is wetlands themselves, because of their very nature, if you think about what happens in a wetland system, it's trees and plants basically as they grow. They're grounds they're very fertile ground for trees, right? And for all kinds of plant matter. And that is the largest technology that we have for absorbing carbon, right? It's kind of how photosynthesis works, right? It's kind of cool. But as those trees die, or plant matter dies in especially a wetland area, rather than that carbon being released out, as we die, our bodies die, we are made of carbon that gets released up as well or gets emitted. In a wetland, it actually gets sequestered. And it's kind of similar to what, if you've heard the word sequestration, an energy company might do if they're using, let's say, coal or natural gas to generate power. There is a concept around capturing that carbon and then burying it in the ground. And that effectively is taking the carbon out of the air and it's going back into the ground. Now, it's kind of expensive to do right now, so that's why you don't do as much of it. But that's effectively the same concept.
I wanted to mention that we actually started a little program with the kids at the high school, that are very interested in these subjects. And we created a number of small projects for kids to study this effect. How does it trade off? How much do you need? How much you use in your house? How much you use in your school? And we're planning to kind of collect all that data, maybe present it at a future forum. So maybe you get some more detailed information. And the kids get to be involved, which is a nice thing. So it's just to mention that.
Thank you. Joel Arbeitman. I just wanted to point out some hard statistics that weren't mentioned here. As part of the UN report that was mentioned, the report stated that we had until 2030 to reduce our global carbon emissions by 45%. So, think in terms of driving 45% less, eating 45% less meat and dairy, turning your thermostats down 45%. I mean, we're talking some pretty radical stuff here. But how are we going to do it? So, you know, there is an extreme urgency to this. This isn't, you know, doing a few little things. I think we need to think outside the box. Some of the things that might be things that we could do that would help the situation may not be palatable to the public. They're going to look at you and say, what do you mean I can't eat meat or I can't drive my car? I mean, we have a real problem with that people haven't really woken up to the urgency of what we're confronted with here. So I just wanted to highlight that a little bit. And one other last point I wanted to make. A report based on a study that was done at Harvard of the Arctic sea ice melting, which everybody's very familiar with, came out yesterday. And that 45% urgency that I referred to in their report that was published last October of 2018, the Harvard study said the following, and it's just shocking. They found that due to the melting of the sea ice, nitrous oxide is being released at a very high rate. Nitrous oxide, some people have heard the statistic when you talk about cows that they emit methane, which is 10 to 30 times the greenhouse capture damage of carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is 300 times, and they have found that the rate the rate that it's being given off, nitrous oxide in the Arctic, is 12 times what they had expected. And that 45% was based on an understanding of the gas emissions as the sea ice melted. So we're really facing a very severe situation. And what I would like to see us all do is really try to come up with everything. Like nothing should be off the table. If it's not politically palatable, say it anyway. Maybe we have to do a better job selling it or explaining the urgency to the community. But get it on the list. Everything should be listed, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to things that we think people would be comfortable with. I mean, we may not be able to sell it, but at least we'll have identified it and have it as a goal. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Cathy Rooney. I just wanted to point out, because you thought we weren't really experiencing global warming here, but in 2016 we had a record-breaking drought, and we were within 7 or 8 days in our town in Ashland in Massachusetts, near Boston, eastern United States, about to run out of water. So this past summer we had 45 days of 90-degree plus heat. We're experiencing it right now. I don't know what else to say.
One of the statistics I actually forgot to mention is that the 10 hottest years. Do you want to guess 10 hottest years? Actually, let's do 20 hottest years. How many years back do you think, in what period would you expect to see that, let's say from 1950 onwards? When do you think the last 20 hottest years are?
Could you repeat the question?
Last 20 hottest years for the world overall on average?
This century.
The last 25 years. 4 hottest years? Last 4. Literally the last 4. Right? That's real.
I had 2 things. I'm Chuck Litz, by the way. I had 2 things I wanted to say. One is just in addition to what Joel said. It's the problem with cows is because they're eating soybeans and corn, which they don't naturally digest if they are grass-fed. They don't emit, which is something to think about when you're thinking about what beef you're buying. The other thing I wanted to say was I have a friend who has been almost as fanatical about this as I am. And he was trying to compute all his carbon, and he got it all down, and he's doing this, that, and the other thing. And then he looked at it, and it turned out that he had gotten it down to neutral except for one thing, which is that it turns out that he had spent 50% as much carbon as he did the previous year because he had taken 2 trips to the West Coast by airplane. And I always think of my father when we had the oil crisis, back in the 70s, and my parents were going to Miami or something like that, and I said, gee, we're short on fuel, and he said, oh, it's okay, we're not driving, we're flying.
Yeah.
Just one thing occurs to me that people want to know, and I think the board will want to know. How are you going to measure progress? How do we know how we're doing with this? Are there objective measures? Do we have a baseline we can apply, and how do we get to that?
So we will talk a little bit about it, right? And we want to kind of share with you. Today was as much about education as it is about actually coming up with a plan and really rallying the community, right? When we originally wanted, as the sustainability committee, to put the resolution up in spring, in the spring town hall, and I think we got some very valid feedback that there was confusion about what the term was and what we were trying to achieve, and so the Board of Selectmen said, go out and actually educate the community and rally the community around this, and we can do this in the fall, and in the meantime, go build a plan anyway, right? That's not stopping you. I think that was fairly good feedback. So we'll talk about that, Rob, a little bit. But short answer to that is you start with an energy audit of some kind, right? We kind of have to get a baseline of what we as a community put out there ourselves. And it's only when you understand the size of the problem that you can start to tackle the problem. And you also have to think about what are the sources, right? Now, I know some of the sources because I've done some research on it, and we're not an atypical town. Some of the biggest sources for a town like us, not surprisingly, buildings make up about 48% of emissions. Heating, cooling, pretty standard stuff. I apologize, the slide's gone a little wonky, I think, when we shifted formats, but we're a fairly small town. We don't really have an industrial base in town as such, right? But we do have businesses, and they tend to contribute about 8%, right? And again, for our town, it might be a little off, so that's part of what the audit would do. Transportation and mobility is usually the second big one, right? We all commute to work, especially as the kind nature of the community that we are. Most of us don't work in town, right? We are commuting, so 36%, right? One of the things that you have to start thinking about then is how do you shift at least the work that happens within town? I drove from my home to the library because I didn't really have a choice, right? How do we start thinking about what the nature of the town will look like so that I didn't have to do that, right? I think some of those things are starting to happen as well. And then there's an 8%, natural biological resources. Again, like I said, creation of carbon and absorption of carbon is a natural process. And it's about 8%, right? So we kind of looked at the 4 sort of biggest categories, grouped a few categories. You could divvy this up into a lot more slices. But what we wanted to do, it's actually a good point to segue out, based on some of the comments you guys already made as well, is we wanted to actually think about how we might go ahead and address some of those areas. So Matt, you want to talk about sort of how we're going to do this? Sure.
So I'm excited about this part because we're going to kind of break up into groups. What we think going forward is that we would probably approach this by looking at things like transportation separately, buildings separately, biological resources like agriculture and composting, that would be a separate category because it's a pretty big topic. So as you came in, most of you are given numbers. And how many people don't have a number? Okay, just a couple, all right. So we have a couple more numbers for folks who don't have them. But what you'll do is if you look around the room, you'll see numbers. So each of these numbers corresponds with a number that you have. And we'd like you to, when I'm done speaking, get up and kind of walk to that section. And you'll have a small group of maybe 6 or 7 folks. And there's a topic written there. So and there will also be a sustainability committee member in that group. So if you have any questions, they can help you. But the idea right now is to just sort of start talking about this, and we have ideas as a committee, but we wanted to expand out and get a wider view from the town and more perspectives involved. As you're thinking about this, I think you'll probably come up with a few different categories of things. You may have solutions, you may have ideas, you may think of challenges, you may have questions. So we'll kind of try and track those, and we'll be using that information going forward. And the other thing I want to say is just as you're working on this, really try to think long-term. Start with the vision of, okay, it's 2050 and we've achieved our goal, we're at net zero. What kind of changes would it take to reach that point? There's going to be a lot of detail work and a lot of things like budgets and energy audits and things like that. Don't worry about that right now. We're kind of starting broad, and we want to have a broad scope, and we can narrow it down later as we start to prioritize. Did you have a question, Kathy?
What do the numbers represent?
It's just each number has a topic associated with it, and you should have a number. So in your hand.
4 topics that's up there, right? So this is buildings.
I was going to say that's how much carbon you get. It's like that's your ratio that you get.
There is actually, believe it or not, a carbon budget out there, and in a future session, I'd love to sort of share that. Maybe we can do something in the farmers market that we can talk about the world carbon budget. Some pretty interesting topics out there. I did want to add one thing, Matt, if you don't mind. As part of this process, right? I think you made a great point. No ideas are bad ideas, right? So at this stage, don't think about, oh, that's not going to happen. This is about brainstorming, right? This is about sort of thinking big. It might feel kind of foolish. Throw it out there. Some of us might laugh about it, but then think about all the biggest things that have happened. At some stage, someone brought it up and someone laughed, right? And then it took time for it to become reality. Approach it, with that kind of humility and that kind of respect, but throw it out there. Worst case, it won't stick.
2 practical matters. Sustainability committee members, there are notepads in the back. Try to grab one, and we're going to take notes. If there isn't someone in the group who can take notes, try to designate somebody. And then for people who might have trouble hearing, we do have another room that one group will go out there and meet because it's going to be kind of noisy in here with all the groups. So just look for Rob. He's going to head that way, and you can trade numbers if you want to go with him.
I think the most important thing I learned is that no one piece of this puzzle is by itself, and that each group had a hard time just isolating its particular program, and we need to look at the thing as a holistic issue and approach it from all the different sides at once. So, and I'm particularly interested in the building side and planning board and stuff, and that covers it all.
Honestly, I got so much data that it's hard to pick one thing, but I think the one thing that I learned is that this town has a group of people with a vision, and we have leadership, and I thank the people who made it happen and our town leaders for supporting it. I learned a ton.
So my takeaway from this was really just how important it is to think about energy efficiency and keeping a net zero approach in mind with everything that we do in town, whether it's development, whether it's residential, that it's really imperative to communicate and make sure that we're all moving in the same direction towards a net zero community.
I thought this was really an inspiring meeting tonight because we came up with a lot of great ideas and really practical approaches to achieving net zero and addressing the urgency of climate change. And I think I just couldn't help comparing it to our experience with Eversource. Instead of expanding a gas pipeline, they should be talking to us about how to achieve net zero, and they wouldn't necessarily have to do this gas pipeline replacement, this expensive replacement and expansion project. So.
So back in 1984, I started working as a civil engineer and was struck by the recurrence of 10-year storms within 1 year a couple of times. And the old adage was, well, it's just a 1 in 10 chance of having it, doesn't mean you can't have 2 in 1 year. But it was happening year after year. And I knew something was up. Now, it took another 20 years before I understood that that was climate change, but I was seeing the effects already then, and they've been beating that drum for a long time. So it's time for us to tighten our belts on carbon.
So would you agree that having that little bit of a breakout type of thing, especially when it's a slightly smaller group, would be useful, or do we lean more towards presentations type of stuff? They're good. All right, excellent, excellent. All right, so, oh, thanks. Appreciate that. All right. All right. So I had asked, just housekeeping, I'm going to make that announcement again. One, as you're walking out, if you'd like to be interviewed by the good folks at WACA-TV, they would like a few volunteers. They're right at the back, the gentleman in red right there with the big camera looking thing. All right. I'd asked each of you to maybe pick for each group maybe a person, so maybe we'll start with, just to be contrarian, with group 4. It's not going to be Michael, we know that for sure. Thank you. So I'll give you maybe a couple minutes, just summarize as best as you can. If you want to go a little bit more, I will cut you off at about 2.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll do what we have. So this is not necessarily in any particular order, and I haven't gotten everything, but I've gotten most of it, I hope. Mass transit, rideshare, we need more and easier. Permeable paving. Solar on all roofs, work with companies for discounts for every roof in Ashland. Building code changes to promote this. Gas tax to fund sidewalks, bike lanes, roads for all modalities of transportation, walking, biking, etc. Develop densely versus sprawl. Plant trees, swap dead ones. Turn off lights, especially at night. Advocacy and education like this. School buses, use them. Safer roads, lower speed. More charging stations. The green economy creates new jobs like cleaning snow off panels, et cetera, besides installing them. More local source food, et cetera. Those are the big things we talked about.
And your topic was?
Transportation. Okay, so how did I do time-wise?
You did great. I have a question for you.
Sure.
How many folks in your group felt that it was achievable to go net zero, and was there even a conversation around it?
No, but we started having discussions about how we would do it.
All right, lovely. So I would assume that means that you assume that it was possible. And
Oh yeah. I don't think anybody there thought it wasn't possible.
Lovely. Thank you. All right. Big round of applause. Come on. Thanks. All right. So we'll go for group 1. Just tell us which group you were, what your topic was, and then.
Group 1. Hi, I'm Karen. Our question was, how can we incentivize businesses to reduce and increase efficiency? Increase efficiencies in their equipment, operation, and buildings. Sorry, I couldn't really read that. Okay, so we have a couple of ideas. First, we thought maybe grocery stores, especially those who use a lot of refrigeration, which we understand is a big contributor to global warming, we could find out what best practices are for greenest refrigeration systems and encourage grocery stores and restaurants to try to move toward using those sorts of refrigeration systems. And in the same vein, sort of develop a green business certification program where we have businesses competing with each other within categories like all the pizza places or restaurants for who can get certified as a green, and then have certifications up in the restaurants and on their websites so that then we can patronize the companies that have the best certifications for the most green programs. A formal composting system for restaurants we thought of, making some code changes so that businesses are required to put up solar panels, charging stations, so for however many parking spaces, there need to be a certain number of charging stations, especially for new parking lots going in, but then also over time requiring current parking spaces, lots to have a certain number of charging stations for each number of spaces, and then also code changes for the number of trees that can be removed, or if you have to remove trees to build a project, that you have to replace the exact same number of trees in the town that you take down. We thought of having an excise tax rebate for whoever has an electric car. My idea was a full rebate. Rob's idea was not to do that. We also really loved this program and thought maybe you could show it to the Ashland Business Association because they have regular meetings, and the more you publicize, the more people know what we now all know that we saw, the more they get energized and excited about taking steps to reduce emissions. And so we were hoping you could show this, could show this to the Ashland Business Association, educate them, and then ask them to brainstorm just like we did. The more people we get brainstorming and get excited, the better. Lawn companies, asking them to transition to using electric equipment rather than their extremely loud gas guzzling blowers. DPW, we're wondering if they can change their procurement and start getting greener equipment, that when they buy equipment that they should be trying to purchase greener equipment. And then, oh, I already got that one at the end. So that's it. That's it.
And you all having a debate about whether it was feasible to achieve net zero? We did. All right, lovely. Lovely. All right, so we did 1 and 4. Let's do 2. Talk about what your topic was.
Okay, our topic was buildings, and because these things are so intertwined, we had a really hard time just staying with buildings because it's all one big thing. But the questions involved incentivizing people to retrofit old buildings, what can the town do to adapt and adopt new building codes and maybe zoning rules to improve that, and also looking for benchmarks and what opportunities for learning could come from net zero schools. We thought that it would be important to leverage 0% or low interest loans to help homeowners and small businesses in particular to retrofit, and that the Needham Bank beautification loans could be expanded, or similar things could come up for this purpose. That our zoning laws could be modified to encourage things like co-housing communities, which have greater density in a small space and more open space, and also potentially tiny houses or similar things in smaller spaces, so that, again, we don't cut down as many trees, and we can have efficiencies of scale and also greater community, more sharing, live lighter on the land. All of these things fit that way. And as far as the school question, educating students, would be by having them living and working in a net zero building. If we can get that school, they will, proselytize for it. They'll think it's cool. They'll talk to each other and to their parents, and that we should have, again, parking arcades with solar panels. Everywhere that there's a parking lot on any municipal surface should eventually have solar panels. And then a more kind of fuzzy concept of, we got all this extra space. People have huge houses that aren't being fully utilized. Businesses are only open half the time. Are there businesses that could be using the same space at night? We're talking about what could we do to make new buildings more efficient, but the key thing, Joel's words were, we just need fewer buildings. Why are we building all these buildings when we've got all of this empty space? So let's think about how the space we currently have can be used better, and future space doesn't have to be so big. And the developers are all about more money, bigger houses, but I think that's past. There are still people looking for McMansions, but I think we need to find some way to incentivize builders to build smaller rather than build bigger, because all those big houses have lots of empty space that's just being heated, and that's crazy.
Thank you. All right. One? Yes? 5. Oh, 5. Well, yeah, actually, 5. We'll go for 5 first.
Do 5 first?
Yes. Well, 4. Yes.
So our topic was, my name's Eddie. Our topic was electricity and how to reduce the amount of electricity being used. The discussion quickly went to solar panels, because that's a way to produce electricity, and then to trees, because trees, we've got them, and then we can't put solar panels on a house that's covered with trees. And is it better to have trees or the solar panels? What's the balance? We don't know the answer to that question. But if we take down the trees, or if we need to take down trees to replace trees and put them into the town or fund a tree in the town forest, that might be a way to achieve a little bit of parity on the tree question. One of the concepts was requiring solar panels to be on new houses that are built, and I guess apartment buildings and so forth. The other discussion item was having to do with the appliances in the house, and we got to induction stoves, and perhaps there's a way to incentivize energy-saving appliances over what we may have now, and an induction stove versus a resistance stove would be a significant change. Again, it changes your energy footprint a little bit, but then you don't have to cool that same air that you just heated with the regular electric stove, with the air conditioner or heat pump. And that took us to the heat pump question for houses, replacing our gas and oil and resistance heating with heat pump-based units, so that we can capture the advantage of heat pumps, which give you more heat than the energy that went in, meaning you can have a positive or a coefficient of efficiency that's greater than 1. And besides that, we talked. That's pretty much where we were. So, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And number 1. I don't think we did one already. 3. Sorry, that was my fault. I obviously can't keep track of numbers, and I should have just gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes I'm a little too clever by half. Or like my wife likes to say, you never were clever, buddy. You want to do that? Yeah, absolutely.
Because that way I don't have to worry about where I put the microphone. We did biological resources, and we talked an awful lot about curbside composting. A lot of this stuff is going to sound very much like what you all have talked about. Apparently, these boundaries are not quite that obvious. Curbside composting. There should be more opportunities for apartment complexes to compost or recycle. That tends to be a difficulty. On the way in, Tess said to me that Black Earth, if you use Black Earth, it's a composting company, and if there are more people that are part of it, it's cheaper for the people who are involved. Schools need to compost. More community gardens. Food waste shouldn't be food wasted. If we take our school food waste and send it to organic farms, it's being done in Sherburne. It can be done here. If there is land that is clear-cut, like land on the end of Harrington Drive, maybe we can incentivize people to put their land either giving it back to the town or adding trees to the area. They're not using it for anything because they can't sell it. We should have tree cutting restrictions. We could have green roofs. We could have more solar parking covers. We could have solar-ready resolutions. Is that what we said? Okay. Thank you, sorry. School cafeteria trays. Why are these things styrofoam? Can we do reusable or compostable items for our school lunches? We could make meatless Mondays at school. We could sell it to be kind of cool, you know? We do an awful lot of climate education. We need more clearly marked recycling bins in places like businesses and things like Stop and Shop and Shaw's and whatever else is in town. We should get little kids to make cute videos about education, composting, and all of that neat kind of stuff, because everybody will pay attention to a cute little kid. We have lots of examples from the Cambridge Public Schools and the Cambridge Town resolutions and restrictions that we could follow. If Cambridge can do it, why can't Ashland? You know, we're good.
All right, thank you. All right, we're gonna start winding this down, right? We did want to share a few other things, but hopefully, you know, you're kind of seeing a couple of things I picked up. One, yeah, they sounded like similar things, but believe it or not, each one of those things probably, you know, like we said, it's silver buckshot, right? All of those things sort of have to come together because they all address a portion of a problem, right? And I actually love that idea of reusing buildings because I was part of a conversation where we were talking about sharing cars. The thought of sharing a building, that was a new idea for me completely, right? So that one just took me off a little bit, right? I'm glad we came up with one idea that I hadn't actually heard anywhere else, so that was awesome. But overall, right, hopefully this was a good experience. What we wanted to kind of share with you now was sort of a roadmap that we started thinking through, and this is actually coming from, I think it's ICANN, right, Rob? MAPC, right? So MAPC sort of has this process that they recommend, right? So how do you develop a program around net zero, right? And we are sort of phase one here, right? So creating the advocates, stakeholders, education, and outreach. And education and outreach is more than us sitting in this room. My hope, our hope, is that each one of you is now an advocate, sort of takes that message out further. Each one of you is able to go to get your own sphere of influence, right? Maybe someone can help us figure out how to get into the schools, and maybe you can do the presentation, right? There was someone who made a suggestion, I go do the presentation. Well, why don't one of you? It's not that hard, and it's, you know, you spend the time today. It might actually be fun, right? So we want to share the progress, obviously. The next thing we will be doing is introducing a net zero initiative at town meeting and forming a committee to create a plan. I think right now the sustainability committee is probably the de facto committee to go do this, but we'd really like to see a wider engagement because, you know, we are a limited set of folks as well, and you know, we've got some, I'm really passionate, and every single person I work with is super passionate, but it's still a limited group, and you know, you really need the community to be sharing ideas. And then, so fall, we want to put the resolution out there, so hopefully every one of you obviously is supporting it, because otherwise they'll come and find you. But you're also getting your neighbor and them, you know, every one of you gets 5 people, 10 people, you know, this thing can really grow. this was part of a conversation I think, Rob, we were having, right? So what is the actual sort of tactical stuff that we get into then once we do the resolution? And the resolution to me is more like putting a goal out there, so something that we can achieve. It's a vision. But you kind of have to have a tactical plan to achieve that vision, right? First off, measure that local energy use. We talked about it a little bit, I think. You're looking at a greenhouse gas inventory. Where is our sources of emission coming from, so that you can then start thinking about how you might tackle it. Create an expected budget for the initiatives. Clearly, some of these things are going to require funding. We are fortunate that we have a town that has been creative about funding, in the past. So hopefully, Michael, will leverage your creativity here. First, we need a sustainability coordinator, which I think you're already working on. Net zero plan and strategy, and then adopt a binding goal. We're going to jump ahead because as part of the resolution, we'd like to adopt that 2040 goal up front, right? At least as that stretch goal. There are then going to be layered goals underneath that, right? All right. And then finally, you start, incorporating that planning and start tracking progress, right? Now you've got things actually happening. Don't know what those things will be. One of the things we talked about was leveraging forums like this to actually build some of the plan itself, right? Taking some of those ideas, because it would, one way I've seen or read about, towns doing this is they develop a plan and then you start socializing it, right? That's the traditional sort of waterfall way of doing it. A bunch of guys gets together and then, it trickles down. So for something like this, think about that idea about sharing a building, right? 7 of us probably would have never come up with it. I think you kind of have to have the community almost help build that plan out, right? So we'll have to think about how we get this out there, and beyond sessions like this, how do we even communicate this? Because it's going to require a different way of communicating among each other and sort of building almost a mini movement, so to speak, right? All right, anything you'd like to add, Matt, there? I think what you can do, maybe take us out. Sure. Yeah.
First, I want to thank all of you for coming. And you have a question? Sure.
Are you going to put these slides available on your website? And also, are you going to gather all the ideas from the different groups?
Well, actually, I should have mentioned that I want all those ideas back, because you're not walking out of this room with those ideas in your pockets, because we actually do need them. So,
yeah.
Pieces of paper.
So hand them in, and maybe write your email address in case we can't read something. We can email you. If you know that you have bad handwriting, try to write your email really clearly. But I want to thank everybody for coming, and I just want to repeat that sense of urgency. Does everyone know about the climate strike movement? Okay, there's a student in Sweden who is now 15 who started this movement. Her name is Greta Thunberg. If you can, Google her videos. She's incredible. She spoke before the UN, before Davos. She's gone just in the UK recently, quite possibly. And what she says is, she kind of wants, when she speaks to these rooms of, billionaires or world leaders, she talks about she wants them to panic because the house is on fire, and she wants them to really feel that sense of urgency. So I do want to repeat that. I feel like panic isn't the most productive emotion, but I do want people to be in movement. So, get your shoes on, get ready. This is a marathon. We're talking about 2040 here. So, but we need to be moving, and we need everyone else to move. So when you think about who's going to do this too, you're the people who showed up tonight. So it's most likely you are the people who are going to help carry this forward. We definitely, I hope all of you signed in, and there was a box to check if you wanted to volunteer. If you didn't sign that for some reason, it's okay if you want to go and. Okay, good. So you're all volunteers now. Thank you so much. So definitely, we'll be in touch. We're going to take the information from this meeting. We're going to compile it. We'll send out updates. We'll put the PowerPoint out so people can see it and use it. I think that talking to the ABA is a great idea. So we'll probably have a forum on transportation. We'll have a forum on business, and having people get together and do this kind of session around those topics would be great. I also want to give a plug to a couple items at town meeting on May 1st. So we have, I think I'll say this right, hopefully a capital plan that we need to approve that involves funding for downtown improvements and Route 126. And those small amounts of fund will unlock something like 20 million in state funding to make those projects happen. There are sustainability components to both of those projects, increasing pedestrian infrastructure, bike path connections that will happen on 126 to the Upper Charles Trail. There is also approval of a budget which will include, I think, a sustainability coordinator starting this summer, and that's really critical for the town as we're trying to reduce municipal energy use. So definitely go and vote. But mostly, thank you for coming and thank you for caring about this.
Thank you.